We have, Robin Hood was really one of the first organizations that came in early and funded charter schools. And so when you look at the growth of things like KIPP and Uncommon Success Academies, Harlem Success, et cetera, how Robin Hood came in early to support charter schools and alternative educational facets. But the interesting thing about it is this: it's not about the charter schools in particular, right? It's about the idea of, are we willing to really test and innovate mechanisms that really challenge common conceptions about education, and oftentimes common conceptions that were built and done hundreds of years ago, 100 years ago, right? And so, for example, being able to look at, not just the use of technology, but also how exactly can we raise expectations for all students so that you have students who, when they're finishing school, they're actually finishing something that allows them to move on into either college or careers. How exactly are we thinking about, in the military, we talk about this idea of border regions and the danger of border regions, because the challenge of border regions is that no one then can take accountability for an area, right? If it's a border of two countries, then one country said it's this country's fault, the other country said it's that country's fault. We have a similar type of thing in the educational system, where these border areas, these transitions between middle school and high school, elementary school and middle school, high school and college, what then often happens is you have one side who will just blame the other for the product without ever really trying to take accountability for the product. So how exactly do we think about education, not so much in a compartmentalized, siloed facet, but really in a holistic, lifelong learning mechanism, where there are smooth transitions and we are actually preparing students for these type of transitions instead of just looking at it as if, well, they move on from our area and that should be enough. And then how exactly are we thinking about the combination and the collaboration and the conversation between the workforce and the education side? Mm-hmm. Because one thing that we're seeing is the workforce needs are changing rapidly. The things that our employers now need are completely different than our employers needed 10 and 15 years ago, which is completely different than employers needed 30 years ago. Do we now have an educational system that can both keep up with that and then also prepare students for that? Because when Secretary Rice was talking about the retraining of people when they're 35, and we're talking about things like trade agreements, I would argue that, do we need to have a conversation about trade agreements? Yes, and that's fine. But the bigger conversation needs to happen, what about the 10 years before the trade agreements are signed? And are we preparing our workforce for what's going to happen as the workforce continues to change? And so when we're talking about this idea of disillusionment, a huge part of addressing the disillusionment is, do people feel that the training that they're getting and the education that they're getting is actually going to prepare them for the next 50 and 60 years of their life? And that's where being able to be critical and think critically about our educational processes does matter in that.
So let me